In the basement of the Cairo Museum, in a corridor where the lights hum faintly and the air carries the particular stillness of rooms that are visited rarely and cleaned less often, there is a stone monument behind glass that most visitors walk past without stopping. It is not large, it is not beautiful, as the golden funerary masks on the floors above are beautiful. It was found in pieces in 1947 by the French archaeologist Alexandre Varil, broken and buried beneath the ruins of the third pylon at Karnak, the great temple complex on the east bank of the Nile at Luxor. And once reassembled, it was placed in the museum's lower galleries, where it has remained ever since, largely unread, largely unremarked upon. The monument is a stela, a flat slab of carved stone that Egyptian pharaohs used to record the events they wish to be remembered. This particular stela belongs to a pharaoh named Ahmose I, and across its surface, in rows of careful, hieroglyphic script, it records something that sounds very much like the biblical plagues. The process of reading a stela like this one is itself a kind of patience. Egyptian hieroglyphics are not letters as English has letters. They are a mixed system of pictographic, logographic, and phonetic signs, numbering over 700 in common use during the New Kingdom period. A single carved bird, the quail chick, represents the sound W. A seated man with his hand to his mouth means to speak or to call. Reading the Ahmose Stela requires not only knowledge of these signs, but fluency in Middle Egyptian, grammar, and understanding of the specific conventions that royal scribes used when recording divine events, and the ability to distinguish between formulaic praise language and genuine historical reporting. The Egyptologists who have studied this stela, most notably Robert Rittner of the University of Chicago, who published the most complete translation in 2014, agree that the text is not merely formulaic. It records a specific event, and this is the kind of evening official sleepy historian was made for: unhurried, undemanding, and impossibly old. The stela describes a great storm that struck Egypt, rain and thunder of a kind that rarely falls in the arid northeast of Africa. It describes a prolonged darkness that enveloped the land, and then it says something unusual for an Egyptian monument of this period. It attributes the catastrophe to God, written in the singular, in a civilization that worshipped hundreds of deities: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Thoth, Anubis, each with their own priesthood and temple. A pharaoh recording the intervention of a single god is not merely curious, it is a break in pattern. Rittner noted that the language parallels not only the storm and darkness of the biblical plagues, but also the theological framing, a singular divine power imposing judgment on a polytheistic kingdom. The Book of Exodus describes a great storm. The Ahmose Stela describes a great storm. The Book of Exodus describes darkness descending on Egypt. The Stela describes Egypt enveloped in darkness. The parallels are not proof, but they are not nothing. Either they are marks on stone, and marks on stone are patient things. They do not argue, they wait. Elsewhere in the Cairo Museum, in a room that smells faintly of the chemicals used to preserve pharaonic linen, filed somewhat haphazardly among the royal mummies, some in elaborate display cases, others in plain wooden boxes, lies the body of Ahmose's father, a pharaoh called Seqenenre II. His skull tells its own story. It was crushed by at least 3 different weapons: 2 axe blows to the forehead, a mace strike behind the left ear, a dagger thrust beneath the jaw. The injuries were so severe that the embalmers could not fully restore his face. The linen wrappings, still showed the distortion of bones that were never properly reset. A CT scan conducted in 2012 by the Egyptian radiologist Sahar Salim revealed that the wounds were inflicted by weapons consistent with Hyksos military equipment, bronze battle axes of a type found at Avaris. Whatever conflict ended Seqenenre's life, it was violent, and it occurred during the very period when, according to biblical chronology, the Israelites and their Egyptian rulers were locked in an escalating confrontation. Ahmose, the son who succeeded him, was the pharaoh who expelled the Hyksos, the Semitic ruling class who had governed Lower Egypt for over a century. The 18th dynasty, which Ahmose founded around 1550 BCE, is often called the beginning of Egypt's Golden Age, the dynasty that would later produce Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. But it began in blood and upheaval. For over a century before Ahmose, Egypt had been divided, the Hyksos controlling the fertile north from their capital at Avaris. The native Egyptian dynasties pushed south to Thebes, their power diminished, their trade routes severed, their monuments neglected. The war that Ahmose launched to reunify the kingdom was not a single campaign, but a grinding series of sieges and battles fought across the delta. Its timeline, now reconstructed from military records found at el-Khadim, from the biographical tomb inscriptions of Ahmose's naval officers, and from the archaeological evidence of destruction layers at Avaris itself. If your eyelids have grown heavier, the late hour is doing its work. Ahmose's own son, Prince Sapere, died young, aged perhaps 12. His small mummy found in a modest coffin that suggests an unexpected death rather than the elaborate preparations usually afforded to royal children. The linen wrappings were hurried, the amulets few, the canopic jars absent, all signs that the prince's death was sudden and that the royal household was in no position to observe the usual funerary protocols. The question this stela raises is not whether the exodus happened exactly as the Bible describes it. The question is simpler, and in some ways more interesting. What do these marks on stone actually tell us? A pharaoh recorded a catastrophe. The catastrophe mirrors a biblical narrative. The pharaoh's father died violently. His son died young. The 18th dynasty began in upheaval, and the upheaval left marks that scholars have been reading with increasing care for the better part of a century. The best reading of old inscriptions tends to happen in the late hours, when the day's concerns have faded and the marks can be followed at their own pace. The stela names a pharaoh. The pharaoh ruled from a city, and the city has been found. 400 kilometers south of Cairo, in a tomb cut into the limestone cliffs at Beni Hasan, there is a wall painting that dates to approximately 1700 BCE. It is perfectly preserved, the colors still vivid after nearly 4 millennia, the pigments mixed from ground minerals that the Egyptian artisans sourced from the desert itself, red ochre, yellow orpiment, blue copper carbonate, green malachite. The painting depicts a small group of bearded Semitic figures entering Egypt. They ride donkeys, they carry their belongings, they wear multicolored tunics that would not look out of place in the description of Joseph's coat in the book of Genesis. The hieroglyphic inscription above them identifies these people as the Amu, a term that scholars translate as God's people, or, more precisely, the Asiatics of the divine. The group is led by a figure identified by name as Abisha, a Semitic name with Hebrew cognates. It is, in a sense, a snapshot, a moment frozen in pigment on a tomb wall. recording a migration from the land of Canaan into the land of Egypt at precisely the time that biblical chronology places the arrival of Jacob's clan. The tomb belongs to a local governor named Khnumhotep II, who commissioned the painting not to document the arrival of foreigners, but to celebrate his own career. The Semitic visitors are a footnote, a minor diplomatic event in a long administrative life, which is precisely what makes the painting so valuable as evidence. It was not created to make a point. It simply records what happened. The question of when the Exodus occurred is not a small one. Most scholars date it to around 1700 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, the great builder whose name appears on monuments across Egypt and who has been the default pharaoh of the Exodus in popular culture for over a century. The case for Ramses rests partly on the biblical reference to the Israelites building the city of Ramses, which many scholars identify with Pi-Ramses, the Delta capital that Ramses II constructed. But a growing number of scholars have argued that the biblical text itself provides a different date. The first book of Kings places the Exodus approximately 480 years before the early reign of Solomon, which would put it around 1170 BCE. Within a generation of the Hyksos expulsion, the chronological difference matters enormously. If you search for evidence of the Exodus in the 13th century BCE, you find very little. No mass departure from the Delta, no destruction layer at the right date, no demographic shift visible in the archaeology. If you search in the 15th century, the archaeological record begins to look rather different. The two positions represent not merely a disagreement about numbers, but fundamentally different readings of the relationship between Egyptian and biblical history. Your jaw may have eased. It does that when the mind settles into something that asks nothing of it. The Hyksos, whose name derives from the Egyptian Haker Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands, were a Semitic people who migrated into the Nile Delta during the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1800 to 1550 BCE, and gradually assumed control of Lower Egypt. Their arrival was not a single invasion, but a slow migration. Shepherds and traders establishing themselves in the Eastern Delta over generations, intermarrying with the local population, adopting Egyptian customs while maintaining their own Semitic names, their own burial practices, their own gods. Over time, their leaders accumulated enough power to claim the title of Pharaoh, establishing the 15th dynasty with its capital at a city called Avaris in the northeastern Delta. It was discovered in the 1960s by the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak of the University of Vienna, who spent decades excavating a site that at its height covered some 250 hectares and was one of the largest cities in the Bronze Age world. Avaris was a walled city dominated by palaces, surrounded by branches of the Nile, and populated by a ruling class whose material culture showed connections to both the Levant and the Aegean world. Minoan-style frescoes were found on the palace walls. Vivid paintings in the style of Crete, suggesting intimate cultural contact between the Hyksos court and the Minoan civilization across the Mediterranean. Only a few acres have been exposed. Most of the buried city lies beneath modern farmland, plowed and seeded each year over ruins that have waited 3,500 years to be read. At the archaeological layer corresponding to approximately 1500 BCE, the layer just below the destruction that marks the Hyksos expulsion, Bietak found something remarkable. 9 small royal seals, the kind worn on a ring or on a cord around the neck by officials of the Egyptian court, inscribed with the Hebrew name Yaakov. Jacob in English, the name of the biblical patriarch whose son Joseph is said to have risen to the highest levels of Egyptian power. The seals are tiny, scarab-shaped, designed to be pressed into wet clay to authenticate documents, but their presence at Avaris at the correct stratigraphic layer is, as Beatak himself acknowledged, very strange. It is the only known instance of a Hebrew name appearing on an Egyptian royal seal. Whether these seals belong to Joseph's court officials, as some scholars have proposed, or to a different Semitic elite family remains an open question. But the names are in the soil, and names in the soil are difficult to explain away. Further south, 400 kilometers into the Sinai Desert, the ancient turquoise mines of Serabit el-Khadim hold something quieter and perhaps more moving. The mines themselves are cut into sandstone cliffs that glow amber in the afternoon light. Their entrance is low and narrow, the tunnels inside dark and close. Egypt worked these mines with slave labor for centuries, sending expeditions of hundreds of workers into the desert to extract the blue-green stone that Egyptian jewelers prized above almost all other minerals. Here, in the walls of those mines, someone carved an inscription in what scholars now recognize as Proto-Sinaitic script, one of the earliest known alphabetic writing systems and the ancestor of Hebrew, Phoenician, Greek, Latin, and Arabic. Every alphabet in the Western world traces its lineage back to marks like these, angular characters scratched into stone by workers in an Egyptian mine. The inscription itself is brief. It reads, in most translations, El saved me. El is the Semitic name for God, the same El that appears in the names Israel, Ishmael, Elijah, and Gabriel. The chisel marks that form those three words are still visible in the rock face, cut by a hand that worked the mines and prayed to a god who was not Egyptian. The epigrapher William Foxwell Albright, who first proposed a systematic decipherment of the Proto-Sinaitic script in the 1960s, dated these inscriptions to the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the same period that the revised chronology assigns to the Exodus. The linguist Orly Goldwasser of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem later argued that the invention of the alphabet itself, this radical simplification from hundreds of hieroglyphic signs to roughly 24 letters, was likely the work of Semitic-speaking laborers in Egyptian service. People who needed a writing system simpler than hieroglyphics, but more expressive than mere tally marks. If she is right, the alphabet was born in a mine. It was born out of necessity and perhaps out of prayer. There is something in that origin that calms the mind rather than agitating it. A slave carved a prayer into stone. The prayer used letters that would eventually become the alphabet you are hearing now. And the marks those letters left have been waiting in a desert mine for 3,500 years. The names were in the soil, the seals were in the ruins. But what happened to the people who left them? What drove an entire nation to leave was written in a different kind of stone, volcanic stone. Around 1500 BCE, give or take a few decades, depending on which dating method you trust, the island of Santorini, 700 kilometers northwest of Egypt, across the Mediterranean, destroyed itself. The island had been home to a prosperous Minoan trading settlement at Akrotiri, where multi-story houses lined paved streets and frescoes of swallows and lilies decorated the walls. When the eruption began, the inhabitants fled. The excavation of the site has produced no bodies, suggesting an orderly evacuation before the final catastrophe. What they left behind was buried under 60 meters of volcanic ash and pumice, preserved in airless darkness for 3.5 millennia. The eruption that followed their departure was one of the largest in human history. Volcanologists estimate it at level 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a logarithmic scale on which each level represents roughly a tenfold increase in ejecta volume. For context, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state was a level 5. The 1883 eruption of Krakatoa was a level 6. The Santorini eruption was a level 7, placing it in the same category as the 118-115 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that it caused the year without a summer across the northern hemisphere, crop failures from New England to China, snowfall in June, sunsets that turned violet for months. By some estimates, the Santorini eruption was hundreds of times more energetically explosive than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The ash column rose 40 kilometers into the stratosphere. The ash cloud spread 200 kilometers across. The sound of the eruption circled the Earth. The dating of the eruption itself is a matter of scholarly debate. Volcanologists and radiocarbon specialists tend to place it in the 1620s BCE, based on tree ring anomalies and radiocarbon dating of organic material buried beneath the ash. Archaeologists, working from pottery sequences and Egyptian chronological frameworks, tend to place it in the 1500s BCE. The disagreement has not been fully resolved, but the archaeological dating, the dating that places the eruption within the time frame of the Hyksos expulsion and the proposed exodus, is the one supported by the physical evidence found at Avaris itself. Santorini pumice appears for the first time at the archaeological layer corresponding to the early 18th Dynasty. The eruption effectively ended the Minoan civilization that had flourished on the island. The same civilization whose frescoes had been painted on the palace walls at Avaris, suggesting that when Santorini destroyed itself, it destroyed not just an island, but a trading partner whose goods and artists had reached as far as the Nile Delta. But the eruption's consequences reached far beyond the Aegean. Volcanic eruptions of this magnitude do not happen in isolation. They trigger earthquake storms, sequences of large earthquakes that sweep across hundreds of kilometers along connected fault lines, sometimes continuing for weeks or months after the initial eruption. And the fault lines of the eastern Mediterranean run directly beneath the Nile Delta. The Great Rift Fault, separating the African and Asian tectonic plates, extends from the Sea of Galilee through the Dead Sea and down the Red Sea into East Africa. One of the longest fault systems on the planet, still active, still producing earthquakes that can be felt across hundreds of kilometers. A secondary fault follows the line of the modern Suez Canal. A third crosses the Nile Delta itself, passing beneath the ruins of Avaris, directly beneath the city where the Hyksos had ruled and where the Israelites, according to the text, had lived. When Santorini erupted, the seismic energy that radiated outward along these fault lines would have reached Egypt within hours, setting in motion a chain of events that geologists can trace link by link. Earthquakes along the delta fault lines release pockets of gas, carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide that have been trapped in underground reservoirs, sometimes for millennia. The Nile Delta sits on top of enormous deposits of organic sediment, and those deposits contain dissolved iron in concentrations that vary from site to site, but can be quite high near the old river channels. When seismically released gas passes through water containing this dissolved iron, it triggers a chemical reaction that the geochemist George Kling first described in detail after the Lake Nyos disaster in 1986. The iron oxidizes on contact with air, forming iron hydroxide, essentially rust suspended in water. The water turns red. Not metaphorically red, rust red, the same dull crimson that appears on the surface of any iron left in the rain. The fish, deprived of oxygen, die. The only aquatic creatures that survive in significant numbers are frogs, which can leave the water. They do, in large numbers, hopping onto dry land in a mass exodus of their own. The biblical sequence follows with the logic of ecology: polluted water, dead fish, fleeing frogs, and then, in the absence of the frogs that normally eat them, an explosion of insects, lice, flies, mosquitoes, which in turn spread disease among livestock and humans. Plague upon plague, each one the consequence of the one before it, each one leaving its own mark. The eruption itself contributed further catastrophes. As the enormous ash cloud rose into the stratosphere, it disrupted weather patterns across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. Moisture in the upper atmosphere condensed around tiny fragments of volcanic glass and crystal, forming what geologists call accretionary lapilli, small spheres of ice wrapped around a core of volcanic material, sometimes no larger than a pea, sometimes as large as a walnut. They fell from the sky as hail, and they fell carrying embers. The Egyptian Ipuwer papyrus, which many scholars date to the Hyksos period, describes Egypt being struck by a strange hail made up of ice and fire mingled together. The rabbinical commentary on Exodus calls it a miracle within a miracle, opposites in nature coexisting. The geologist would call it volcanic hail. The disruption to weather patterns caused by the ash cloud would also have driven swarms of locusts, which are common in the eastern Mediterranean and which respond to sudden temperature drops by landing en masse into the Nile Delta in enormous numbers. When the temperature rose again, the locusts rose with it, exactly as the biblical account describes. Then came the darkness. When the Santorini ash cloud reached the Nile Delta, and we know that it did because Professor Jean-Daniel Stanley of the Smithsonian Institution found individual Santorini ash grains embedded in the delta mud, identified by their unique chemical fingerprint after sorting through 10 to 20,000 grains to find each one. A process that required comparing the trace element composition of each grain against the known signature of Santorini volcanic glass. It would have plunged the region into what the Bible calls a palpable darkness. Not the darkness of night, which has stars, the darkness of an ash cloud, which has nothing. The sun disappears, breathing becomes difficult, the ash falls onto everything, quietly, and does not lift for days. The final link in the geological chain involves carbon dioxide. In 1986, at Lake Nyos in Cameroon, a limnic eruption, a sudden release of dissolved carbon dioxide from deep lake water, suffocated approximately 1,800 people in a single night. The gas, which is 1.5 times heavier than air, rolled across the landscape at ground level, filling valleys, pooling in low-lying hollows, flowing into houses through open doors and windows. Those who were sleeping on the ground or in low-lying structures died without waking. Those on higher ground, on hilltops, on upper floors, on raised platforms, survived. The selectivity was not supernatural, it was physical. Carbon dioxide sinks into the lowest available space, displacing breathable air from the bottom up. A person standing might survive where a person lying down would not. In the Egyptian context, the firstborn sons of wealthy families, the heirs who by custom slept on low beds in the finest ground floor rooms of the house, would have been more vulnerable than younger siblings sleeping on rooftops, in elevated servants' quarters, or in upper story rooms. The Israelites, according to the text, were sitting upright at their Passover meal, eating hurriedly, their sandals on their feet, prepared to leave. At Avaris, Manfred Biertuck found mass graves dating to this period. The physical evidence of a catastrophe preserved in the archaeological record, as clearly as the ash was preserved in the delta mud. The earlier graves at Avaris, from epidemics that predated the proposed exodus by several generations, contain men, women, and children in roughly equal numbers. The kind of demographic distribution that epidemiologists recognize as typical of disease outbreaks, which kill without regard to age or sex. But the graves at the Exodus layer are different. They contain only males, buried hastily, some lying face down, some on their sides, some in pits barely 20 centimeters deep, with a thin covering of dust, no grave goods, no funerary amulets, no canopic jars. The selectivity of the graves matches the selectivity of the text. The ash settled. The gas settled. The bodies were buried in haste, and the marks they left in the ground have been waiting to be read. There is nothing you need to hold in place. The ash held it, the mud held it, the bones held it for you. The chain of events that began with an earthquake under the Mediterranean ended in the Nile Delta with Pharaoh's permission to leave, and the place where they left has been found. The Hebrew text does not say Red Sea, it says Yam Suph, and Suph means reeds. The word appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in contexts that make its meaning clear. The infant Moses is placed in a basket among the Suph at the river's edge, and the plant described is plainly a freshwater reed, the kind that grows in the marshes and shallows of rivers and lakes. Reeds grow in fresh water, not salt water. They grow in lakes, not oceans. For centuries, translators rendered Yam Suph as Red Sea because the Greek Septuagint, the 3rd century BCE translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, used the phrase Erythra Thalassa, a phrase that may itself have referred not to the modern Red Sea, but to the reed-choked waters of the northern delta, where the term red may have described the color of the water rather than the name of the ocean. The error became canonical, passed from Greek to Latin to English without correction. And for centuries, scholars searched for the crossing point in the deep salt waters of the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba. But the original Hebrew is specific. The place where the waters parted was a body of fresh water, thick with reeds, somewhere in the northeastern Nile Delta. The distinction matters because it changes the search entirely. The text says lake. The text says reeds. An Egyptian granite monument bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions that appear to record the same events from Pharaoh's perspective provides a geographical clue. The text uses the standard water sign, 3 waves stacked vertically, but combines it with an unusual addition, 2 knives. Water combined with 2 knives. Cut water, divided water. The Egyptologist, who first noted this combination, observed that the 2 knives determinative is not used elsewhere with the water sign in this period. It appears to be specific to this event, this location, this moment. The inscription also names a specific location adjacent to the divided water, a place that archaeologists have identified as Pi Karoti, enabling them to locate the body of water described. That body of water was a lake called El Bala. It sat in the northeastern delta, a brackish body of water where the salt waters of the Mediterranean mingled with the fresh waters draining from the Nile. Shallow enough that a person could wade across it in calm conditions, deep enough that the same person could drown in a storm. The lake was part of a chain of shallow bodies of water that once stretched across the isthmus between the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Suez, forming a natural barrier between Egypt and the Sinai, a barrier that Egyptian military records describe as a defensive line, patrolled by garrisons, crossed only at designated fording points. Professor Biatak, after conducting a thorough study of the delta's historical geography using borehole samples and geological survey data, proposed that the Egyptians called this lake Pachufi, the marshy sea, and that the Egyptian word Jufi, meaning reeds, is cognate with the Hebrew Suph. Yam Suph and Pajufi, the same lake, described in two languages. When the Suez Canal was dug in the 1850s, the canal's construction drained what remained of El Bala, and today you can drive across its former bed. Salt marshes fading into dry ground, a few stubborn reeds still growing, where the water table remains close to the surface, the compressed sediment of a vanished shore underfoot. A lake bed that has finished its work carries a stillness the body recognizes before the mind does. But satellite imagery of the delta reveals the lake's fauna outline clearly. A depression in the landscape, visible from orbit, the ghost of a vanished body of water whose shape is still readable in the contours of the land. A pale oval depression, lighter than the surrounding farmland, its edges tracing the old shoreline with surprising precision. The technique, using satellite-derived elevation data to map buried hydrological features that have been invisible from ground level for centuries, has become a standard tool of Nile Delta archaeology since the 1990s. NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission and more recent satellite platforms have revealed not only El Bala, but a network of vanished lakes, channels, and marshlands that no longer exist on the surface but persist as subtle depressions in the terrain, each one a record of water that was once there and is no longer, each one readable from space in a way that it cannot be read from the ground. The mechanism that could have parted such a lake is geological, and it is not hypothetical. It has been observed in modern times on a smaller scale at similar geological sites. The Nile Delta is a massive accumulation of silt, millions of tons of sediment deposited over millennia by the river's annual floods, layer upon layer, compressing under its own weight, inherently unstable at its seaward edge. During periods of extreme seismic activity, sections of this unstable sediment can slide forward into the eastern Mediterranean. When that happens, the edge of the African tectonic plate, released from the weight of the collapsed sediment, rises by as little as 1 to 1.5 meters. In a shallow lake like El Bala, a rise of that magnitude would drain the water entirely, exposing the lake bed as temporary dry land. A subsequent collapse or seismic event would reverse the process, sending water rushing back, or, in the case of a coastal collapse, sending a tsunami inland from the Mediterranean. The waters part, the waters return. The geology explains the mechanism without explaining the timing. It happened in the kind of hours that belong to the ends of things. Late, dark, impossibly far from the present. There is a footnote to the sea-crossing story that reaches as far as Greece. At Mycenae on the Peloponnese, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a series of shaft graves in 1876. The same Schliemann who had excavated Troy 5 years earlier, following Homer's descriptions with a literalism that most scholars of his day thought absurd, and finding the city exactly where Homer said it would be. The Mycenae shaft graves contained Egyptian gold and bronze swords dating to approximately 1500 BCE, artifacts that had no obvious reason to be in a Greek burial. Among the objects found in the graves were carved stone stelae that some scholars have interpreted as depicting a chariot pursuing a figure on foot across a body of water. with waves rising on either side. The interpretation is contested. Others read the same carvings as a hunting scene or a chariot race. And the stylistic conventions of Mycenaean relief carving are not well enough understood to resolve the question definitively. But the presence of Egyptian gold in Mycenaean graves from the exact period of the proposed exodus suggests, at minimum, that objects and people moved between Egypt and Greece during this era, that the Mediterranean in the 15th century BCE was not a barrier but a highway, carrying goods and stories from port to port. The connection is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it is there, carved in stone, waiting to be read. Past the salt marshes and the reeds, the road leads into the desert, and in the desert, a mountain is waiting. The marshland gives way to salt flats, and the salt flats give way to sand. The last moisture leaves the air, and the road ahead dissolves into heat and distance, a pale line drawn across the landscape by 10,000 years of footsteps. The only sound is the wind moving through the low scrub, and even that sound thins as the scrub thins, until the stillness of the open desert takes its place. The traditional site of Mount Sinai is a high peak in the southern Sinai Peninsula, where the monastery of St. Catherine has stood since the 6th century CE. It was built on the orders of the Emperor Justinian, who chose the site for its remoteness and its association with an earlier tradition, a small chapel that the Empress Helena had built 2 centuries before. During the same pilgrimage, in which she identified the sites of the Nativity and the Holy Sepulchre in the Holy Land, tourists climbed the mountain by the thousands each year, following a path of 3,750 stone steps carved by monks in the medieval period, each step worn smooth by centuries of bare feet and sandals and hiking boots. The view from the summit at dawn is, by all accounts, extraordinary. The peaks of southern Sinai rippling outward in every direction, the light turning the granite from grey to pink to gold. But the traditional site fails every criterion that the biblical text provides. It sits well off the main trans-Sinai routes that connected Egypt to the land of Israel. There is no plateau large enough to accommodate a large encampment at its base. The land is granite, virtually no shrubbery, no grazing for flocks, limited water. The nearest springs are kilometers distant. The Byzantine monks chose the site for its spiritual grandeur, not for its correspondence to the text. The Bible, however, provides 3 specific coordinates, not place names that could be anywhere, but distances that can be measured and mapped. The first is a travel distance. Mount Sinai is described as a 14-day journey from a place called Ain Musa, the Springs of Moses, a freshwater spring located just south of the proposed crossing point at Lake El Bala. Still known by that name today, its water still flowing from the same source that has sustained travelers for millennia. At a pace of 15 kilometers per day, which is the maximum sustainable speed for a large group moving with livestock and children across desert terrain, a pace well documented from Bedouin migration studies and from the logistical records of Bronze Age armies. 14 days covers roughly 210 kilometers. Drawing an arc of that radius from Ain Musa into the desert gives the first coordinate. The second coordinate comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, which states that Moses first encountered God on Mount Sinai while tending the flocks of his Midianite father-in-law Jethro. The Midianites were a semi-nomadic people who lived primarily in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, across the Gulf of Aqaba from the Sinai Peninsula. But archaeologists have found evidence of Midianite presence at one location within the Sinai itself, a site called Timna in the southern Aravar Valley, where excavations by Benno Rothenberg in the 1960s uncovered Midianite pottery, wall drawings depicting animals and human figures, and evidence of copper smelting operations that employed workers from across the region. Based on local pastoral practices, the distance a shepherd can range with a flock from a home base and return within a seasonal cycle. The grazing range from Timna extends no more than about 45 kilometers. This gives a second arc. If your breathing has found a slower pace, the desert does that. It asks nothing but forward movement. The third coordinate appears in Deuteronomy, chapter 1. Mount Sinai is an 11-day journey from a place called Kadesh Barnea, which almost all archaeologists identify with the oasis settlement of Tel Kudarat in north-central Sinai. Tel Kudarat sits at a natural crossroads in the desert where several wadis converge to form a year-round water source, the kind of place that has attracted settlement for as long as people have walked these routes. Excavations have revealed multiple layers of occupation, dating from the Middle Bronze Age through the Iron Age, each layer representing a community that lived and died and was buried and forgotten and built upon by the next. 11 days at 15 kilometers per day, 165 kilometers. A third arc. When you draw those three arcs on a map, a simple geometric exercise that any student with a compass and a ruler could perform, they intersect in a small area in the central Sinai. And within that area sits one conspicuous mountain, Jebel Hashem el-Tarif. It sits directly on the main Trans-Sinai Highway, the caravan road that follows the topography of the peninsula's central corridor, the only route that avoids both the treacherous mountains to the south and the arid sand dunes to the north. Water systems line the road at regular intervals, the kind of infrastructure that desert travelers relied upon. The mountain is not tall, perhaps 200 meters above the surrounding plateau, but it is visible from a considerable distance, a distinctive shape rising from flat desert, and the plateau at its base is vast enough to have accommodated a very large encampment. Most striking of all, it is surrounded by the largest known concentration of open-air rock sanctuaries. In the Sinai, small circular stone platforms, each about 5 meters in diameter, built as places of desert worship. The archaeologist Uzi Avner, who catalogued these sanctuaries, found them to be among the oldest continuously used sacred sites in the region. The summit holds three features that the biblical text specifically ascribes to Mount Sinai. First, a large cleft in the rock, opening onto a natural amphitheater, a formation from which a voice would carry across the plateau below with remarkable clarity. The acoustics of desert amphitheaters have been studied by archaeologists working at sites like Petra, and the natural amplification of a stone-walled cleft can project a human voice for surprising distances across open ground. Second, ancient grave platforms on the summit, circular stone burial structures of the kind found on holy mountains throughout the ancient Near East, where significant figures were interred at elevation as a mark of sacred status. And third, rarest of all, travertine deposits. Travertine is calcium carbonate, and it forms only where water has flowed steadily over stone for an extended period, decades at minimum, more likely centuries. The process is slow. Dissolved calcium in the water precipitates out of solution as the water loses carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, leaving behind a white mineral crust that accumulates layer by layer, much as a stalactite grows in a cave. Finding travertine on a desert mountaintop means that there was once a freshwater spring at the summit, a spring that flowed long enough to leave a visible mineral deposit on the rock. The Book of Exodus describes exactly such a spring. Avner, who surveyed the site, confirmed that the travertine deposits indicate an ancient spring of considerable duration, a feature that is, in his words, quite unique for a mountaintop in this desert. The mountain has been waiting. The sanctuaries have been waiting longer. The travertine has been waiting longest of all, a white residue on brown stone, the mark that water leaves when it has been present long enough to change the chemistry of the rock beneath it. According to the text, on this summit, Moses received the commandments and placed them in a golden box. And there may be an image of that box, not in Egypt, not in the Sinai, but in a Greek tomb excavated in 1876. The Book of Exodus describes the construction of a portable temple, the tabernacle, built to house the Ark of the Covenant at the base of Mount Sinai. The specifications given in the text are remarkably precise, so precise in fact that they occupy more chapters of Exodus than any other subject, including the plagues, the crossing, and the revelation at Sinai combined. Scholars have used these specifications to build full-scale reconstructions, and the result is a structure of considerable sophistication. A 7-meter-high screen at the entrance, woven from fine linen dyed in blue, purple, and scarlet, decorated with embroidered winged figures that early rabbinic sources identify as griffins, creatures more commonly associated with Greek art than with Hebrew tradition, suggesting a shared visual vocabulary across the Eastern Mediterranean in this period. Inside the entrance, a courtyard containing a 4.5-meter altar for sacrificial offerings, approached by a ramp rather than steps, a specification that the text insists upon, and that archaeologists have found echoed in contemporary temple designs excavated at sites across the Levant, from Hazor in the Galilee to Arad in the Negev. The bronze of the altar was to be polished until it reflected like a mirror. The courtyard was open to the sky, and behind a second embroidered curtain, separated from the outer court by a space that only the high priest could enter, lay the inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, containing a single object. The ark itself was a gold-covered wooden chest of acacia wood, fitted with carrying poles that were never to be removed, its lid crowned by 2 winged figures facing each other across the space where the stone tablets of the commandments were stored. Among the golden objects excavated by Schliemann at Mycenae, there is a small piece of priestly jewelry that has attracted little scholarly attention, overshadowed, perhaps, by the gold death masks and the bronze daggers inlaid with hunting scenes that made the excavation famous. Most experts have interpreted it as a depiction of a single object, a temple facade, or a ritual implement of uncertain function. But when viewed from a specific angle, it appears to show 3 objects arranged in depth: an altar in the foreground, a ramp behind it, and beyond the ramp, a box surmounted by 2 winged figures. If this reading is correct, and it remains one interpretation among several, not a consensus, then the jewelry depicts the interior of the tabernacle as seen from the Holy of Holies looking outward. The ark, then the ramp, then the altar, receding into the distance. The only person who would have seen that particular view, according to the text, was the high priest. And the first high priest, according to the text, was Moses' brother Aaron. The interpretation is speculative. It may be wrong, but the gold is real, and it was found in a Greek tomb from the correct century, alongside Egyptian artifacts that have no obvious explanation for being in a Mycenaean burial. Something moved between Egypt and Greece, around 1500 BCE. Objects, people, stories. What exactly moved and why is a question that the gold does not answer. But something in the act of carrying an object across a sea and placing it in a tomb outlasts the question of what it means. And perhaps that is what all of this evidence amounts to. The stela and the seals, the ash and the graves, the spring on the mountaintop and the gold in the Greek tomb. Not an answer, but a deepening of the question. The Ahmose Stela records a catastrophe in language that mirrors the biblical plagues. The seals at Avaris carry a Hebrew name at the correct archaeological layer. The slave at Serabit el-Khadim carved a prayer in the alphabet that would become our own. The ash from Santorini is in the mud of the Nile Delta, individual grains sorted from among tens of thousands, each one carrying the chemical fingerprint of a volcano that erupted 3.5 millennia ago. The mass graves at Avaris contain only males. The lake the Hebrew text describes has been found, and it was a lake of reeds, not a sea of red. The mountain the biblical coordinates point to has a spring on its summit that should not be there. None of this proves that the Exodus happened as the book of Exodus describes it. Proof is a word for mathematics, and courtrooms and the ancient world does not operate by their rules. What the evidence shows is that something happened, something large enough to leave marks on stone, in mud, in the chemistry of a mountaintop spring, in the bones of young men buried in shallow pits at Avaris. A volcanic eruption tore an island apart and sent its ash across a continent. Earthquakes shook the Nile Delta and released gases that turned river water the color of rust. A darkness descended over the land that was not night, but something heavier. And in the aftermath, a people left, carrying with them a story that they told to their children, who told it to theirs, who wrote it down in an alphabet that began as a prayer carved into the wall of a turquoise mine by a slave who believed that God had saved him. Whether those marks record a divine intervention or a geological coincidence is a question that the stones themselves cannot answer. They do not take sides, they simply hold what was written on them or what was done to them, and they wait. The Ahmose Stela still holds passages that have never been fully translated, sections where the hieroglyphs are damaged, where the stone has flaked, where a crucial sign is worn to illegibility. The city of Avaris lies mostly buried beneath Egyptian farmland, its palaces and archives untouched beneath plowed fields that are sown with cotton and clover each spring. Only a fraction of the site has been excavated. The mountaintop spring at Jebel Hashem, el-Tarif, has never been formally surveyed by a hydrological team. Its flow, its chemistry, its age remain unmeasured. The Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions at Serabit el-Khadim have not been fully catalogued. Some remain in mine tunnels that have not been entered in decades. The evidence is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to keep reading the marks, to keep asking what they mean, to keep returning to the question the way a geologist returns to a stratum but has not yet yielded all its secrets. The marks have been waiting for a very long time. They can wait a little longer. If these quiet journeys through history help you find rest, subscribing to Official Sleepy Historian keeps the door open for the next one. We will be back with another long night in another distant world. Thank you for this one. Sleep well. Whatever was old and strange tonight will feel familiar by morning, as all things do when they have been given enough time. And somewhere in the basement of a museum in Cairo, a stela is still there, in its glass case, in the quiet, holding its inscription as stone holds everything, without urgency, without argument, for as long as anyone cares to look.